Well, it's so good to see you all again here this morning. Thanks for coming out and being part of Mission Community Church. If you're a guest with us today, just a special welcome to you. My name is Jason. I'm the pastor here at the church, and glad that you're part of what God's doing here, and this nice intimate time that we can come together each week and worship and learn from his word. So we've been following Jesus' last 40 days here on earth before he ascends back up into heaven. And so last week we finished up John chapter 20, and today we start John chapter 21. And one of the interesting things about John chapter 20, I'm going to read the last couple verses just to kind of set where I'm going with this. So John chapter 20, verse 30 says this, Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So to me, that sounds like the perfect ending of a book. I mean, why would you want to keep on going after a verse like that? I mean, Jesus did all these other miracles that aren't even written about in this book, but these are recorded so that you and I might believe. Put some footnotes on there, maybe, an epilogue, appendix, or whatever, and then you're good. But John continues to go on in John chapter 21. And I think why he is doing this, he's adding his epilogue, so to speak, which demonstrates that we really never come to the end of the gospel story. You and I are very much a part of that story today. We don't come to an end. We won't actually come to an end until we're with him in heaven. And even then, it's not even an end because it goes on for all eternity. It just keeps going and going and going. So why does John keep going in John chapter 21? Well, let's see what happens. We're going to pick it up in John chapter 21. We're going to look at the first few verses and kind of break it apart as we go through the passage that we read earlier today. So John chapter 21, verses 1 through 3. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. I think one of the reasons why John keeps going on is because he's reminding all of us that Jesus continues to reveal himself to the disciples after he rose from the dead. So it's not just this one time that Jesus appeared in this upper room where the disciples could have thought maybe we saw something, maybe we saw a hallucination or a spirit. No, John is saying no, over and over and over again, Jesus appeared to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he revealed himself in this way. And he just lists the guys that he revealed himself to. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, or T. Diddy, that we learned from last week, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. Now, I don't know why he doesn't mention these two guys' names. But maybe a thought to consider as we go through this passage today is that we can insert our own name into this text. Where he says, two other disciples, just place your name in there. Verse 3, Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we'll go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So let's set some of the context here, because at first glance, when you go from John chapter 20 to John chapter 21, there's something weird that happens. I mean, in John chapter 20, at the end, they're in the upper room. Jesus is revealing himself to Thomas. Thomas is touching his side, putting his fingers in the holes of his hands. And then all of a sudden you get to John chapter 21 and they're going fishing. So what happened here? How did they all of a sudden end up by the lake? I mean, did Jesus' presence, did it stir them to any type of action? I mean, was the resurrected Lord, was it convincing enough that they went out and did something about it, or did they just go fishing? And we don't know why in John they ended up by the lake or the Sea of Galilee. But if you turn back to Matthew chapter 28, it talks about during the first appearing of Jesus to the disciples in that upper room, he actually commands the disciples to go to the mountain in Galilee and to wait for him there. You don't get that from John. So you have to put all of the Gospels together in order to get the full picture of what's going on here. So Jesus told his disciples, hey, go to this mountain and wait for me. So they do that. Notice that if you read back in Matthew chapter 28, he says all 11 of the disciples go to this mountain to wait. But by the time you get here in John, there's only 7 of the disciples. So we don't know where the other 4 went. But what we do know from John chapter 21 is that all of the disciples that went fishing were actually fishermen. I mean, that's what they did before Jesus came and called them to follow him. So John says that Jesus revealed himself to these 7 disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. It's another word, it's the Roman word for Galilee, so by the Sea of Galilee. We don't know where the other 5 disciples are, but we know that the fishermen are present. Now, depending on commentaries that you read, there's a different view or idea of what's going on here. There's some disagreement that takes place. Some theologians believe that Peter and these fishermen were in the right to be going fishing. So as we see who Jesus is, as we put all the pieces together, it doesn't mean that our everyday lives stop. We still have bills to pay and things like that. So it makes sense now that they're not with Jesus like they had been for the last 3 years, that they would go back to work and start providing for their families and paying the bills and things like that. Another example of this is actually Paul. When you read in Acts chapter 18, it says that Paul was a tent maker. And so he often, even in his missionary journeys, would use his skill of being a tent maker to help support his own ministry, to help support his own livelihood. So there's some theologians that believe that, the guys were doing what they were supposed to be doing. They needed to go fishing. On the other hand, there's a group that believe that they were completely in the wrong, that Peter got impatient waiting and threw his hands in the air and said, I'm going fishing. I can't wait any longer. I'm going to go do what I know what to do. Jesus first meets Peter and Andrew while they were fishing. And the reason why the theologians kind of land on this, that they were in the wrong, is because when you look back at Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 to 20, it says, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers. So Jesus is walking by the sea. He sees Peter and Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. So the word left in verse 20 in Matthew chapter 4 is the same word that's used when a husband and wife get divorced. They are terminating a contract. And so when the disciples left their nets, it's not like they're temporarily leaving behind their nets. No, they divorced themselves from their livelihood, from what they were doing. And then further in Luke chapter 9, Jesus teaches this to the disciples. When people are talking about what is the cost of following you? Like, what is this going to cost me? Jesus says in Luke 9, verse 62, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. So this idea that when we follow Jesus, you're either all in or you're not. And if you're all in, there's no looking back on your past. There's no going back to what you're comfortable doing or what you once did. It's all about Jesus and following him. So from this train of thinking, this group of theologians believe that they were in the wrong for going fishing. Because Jesus had called them from that. They are now looking back at what they once did, their comfort, their security, the familiarity of what they used to do. I don't know where I land exactly on the two. I mean, I almost think of maybe a third option. I mean, if the disciples are waiting for Jesus by the mountain in Galilee, maybe Peter just wanted to go fishing to get some fish for when Jesus came so they could have a meal together. And I don't think we need to get too caught up in the reason of who was right and who was wrong, because I think there's a bigger point in what we're going to talk about here today. And that is, whatever the circumstance, whether the disciples were in the right or in the wrong for going fishing, we still need Jesus, no matter what it is that we do. So if you're a construction worker, you need Jesus in your construction working. If you're a teacher, you need Jesus in your teaching. If you're a doctor, you need Jesus in your medical practicing. If you're an accountant, you need Jesus in your putting numbers together. Everything that you do, you need Jesus. As I think what we have ended up doing in our culture today in the Western church is somehow we've compartmentalized the spiritual from the secular. That Sunday we can devote it all to Jesus. It's all the spiritual, the religious type of thing. But then when we go Monday through Saturday, it's my life, it's what I'm doing, it's my living, my family. We divorce the two. And so what I think John is beginning to say here is that no. Jesus is in your everything, no matter it is what you're doing. Without Jesus, we can do nothing. Nothing. Doesn't matter if it's spiritual or secular, we can do nothing. When we do things in our own strength and understanding, we do so as humans impacted by sin, darkness. There's no fruit that can come from it. John chapter 3, verses 19 to 21 say this, "And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed." Listen to this. "But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God." So this idea that we compartmentalize or segregate our spirituality from our secular living is a completely bad theology, a bad philosophy of how we ought to live. Because Jesus ultimately is in our everything. Without Jesus, we can do nothing. Acts 17 says, "In him we live and move and have our being." One of the times that this just hit me heavily was when Colleen and I lived in North Carolina. We both worked in the secular world. I worked for a biotech company. Colleen was in the salon. And we would lead youth groups to missions trips down in Mexico. And we would do this for a couple of years, and we always looked forward to going to Mexico, leading this group of students, because it just totally took us out of our everyday context. But somehow our thinking got warped because we would actually pay to go on a missions trip to go spread the gospel in another place. And then when we would come home, we would get right back into our normal routine, going to work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and then the church thing on Sundays. And as we did that more and more and more, we began to question, why are we paying to go on a missions trip to preach the gospel, and we're not even doing it in our workplace, in our neighborhood, in our family? We started compartmentalizing the spiritual from the secular. And as God started laying that on our hearts, we started to realize, no, you can't separate the two. If we are so impacted by this Jesus, by someone who came to die for me and rose again so that I might have life, then he ought to infiltrate every aspect of my life. And so it was no longer going on a missions trip just to simply preach the gospel. It's preaching the gospel with our words and actions no matter where we are, no matter the day of the week. Without Jesus, we can do nothing. So even in our day in and day out routine, we can do nothing. And we see that in verse 3 of John chapter 20. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. can't even catch fish. Let's pick it up in verse 4. So it was dark. Verse 4, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. The disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work. You know, if I go fishing sometimes, I take my shirt off because it's hot and the sun's beating down. So he put on his outer cloak, went back into the water, threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. So as morning comes, they transition out of darkness. I think John's doing a couple of things here. He's starting to kind of speak a little metaphorically. Since Jesus is the light of the world, he's ushering in the light out of the darkness. When he is present, he dispels darkness. He's ushering in the morning. So the disciples see Jesus on the shore, but they don't recognize that it's Jesus. This continues to puzzle me, because if you've spent the last 3 years of your life with Jesus and he's already revealed himself to you 2 other times after he's risen from the dead, how can you not recognize him? Now, granted, he was 100 yards off, so I'll give that to him. Maybe he was maybe had bad eyesight. They just couldn't put him together. But it still questions in my mind, why do they have such a hard time recognizing him anytime he shows up? So they don't recognize him. To make matters worse, Jesus calls out to them and says, "Children." So don't you think if they were with Jesus, I mean, you probably got familiar with this term children since Jesus was teaching them, and they often called him rabbi. And so when Jesus calls out children, perhaps that might have sparked something in their minds to recognize that this is actually Jesus talking to them. But no, Jesus says, "Children, do you have any fish?" Now, when you look at that word children in the Greek, it's actually boys. So just imagine, Jesus is calling out to the boat, "Boys!" If some stranger calls me a boy, I'm getting a little bit anxious inside. Like, you have no right calling me a boy. And then Jesus says, "Do you have any fish?" But the way that the Greek is worded, it's more phrased like, "You don't have any fish, do you? Why don't you try casting it on the other side of the boat?" So rubbing salt into the wound, the disciples aren't catching any fish. This is what they do. This is what they know. This stranger from the shore is saying, "Boys, you don't have any fish, do you? Why don't you cast your net on the other side of the boat?" Don't tell me how to do my job. So what is maybe going through their minds at this point? Again, it's just puzzling to me that some stranger is calling out in their mind, some stranger is calling out from the shore, and they're doing what he says. When Jesus says, "Cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat," there's an interesting meaning to that word right. It comes from the Greek word dexios. We get our English understanding of the word ambidextrous. And so there is a meaning to this word right that is actually directional, like right-hand side. But then it's also used to convey this idea of truth, or like the right way, the true way. And so Jesus says, "Cast your net on the right-hand side of the boat." What if Jesus is saying no matter what we do, no matter where we are, do things the right way? Don't do things in your own strength. Don't do things in your own understanding. Hey, try it my way, the true way, and let's see what happens. So the disciples do what Jesus said, and then their nets are bursting full of fish. They can hardly get the fish out of the water. And this is what I think John is saying here. Even when we don't recognize that Jesus is involved and present, Jesus is involved and present. So there's situations that may happen in our own work environment, some blessing that we come across, and we may not recognize Jesus' hand in it, but Jesus' hand is in it. And we may not recognize that Jesus is present with us, but Jesus is present with us, even when we fail to recognize him. There are times that we fail to do this in our own lives, and it's comforting to me when the disciples who lived with this guy, did life with this guy for the last 3 years and experienced him after he rose from the dead, they still miss it. It gives hope to me that even as ignorant as sometimes I can be, that Jesus is still there, still present, and still working. And sometimes all the difference to success, whatever our hand is doing, is the width of the boat. When we think we're doing something the right way, and then for some reason we get some sort of moving or inkling to change how we do it the true way, and God blesses it. Even when we don't recognize it's him. He's good. Now, it's my opinion that the disciples are starting to experience some deja vu here in this whole experience of the casting the net on the other side. If you back up to Luke chapter 5, this type of scenario actually happens in the past. So Luke chapter 5, verses 3-8, getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. So what was happening is that Jesus was with his disciples. There was a whole big crowd gathering to hear Jesus teach. So they end up going out a little bit into the water so that Jesus could have some space to teach to the crowds. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word, I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. They had so much fish that it started weighing down both of the boats. And they came and filled both of the boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." So a couple years later, the disciples find themselves in a similar situation. They're fishing, they can't catch any fish. This guy from the shore tells them to cast the net on the other side. They start hauling up this big net full of fish, and it's all beginning to feel a little too familiar. They've been here before. And the idea is that with Jesus, we can do anything. So the first part, without Jesus, we can do nothing, but with Jesus, we can do anything. And we may not recognize Jesus' presence, but he is always present. We may not recognize his leading in our circumstances, but he is always leading. And whether in work or in ministry, whether in the spiritual or the secular, if Jesus is in it, we can do anything. They had a net full of fish. So then as we continue in verse 9 of chapter 21 of John, he says, when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid out on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now there's a couple comparisons I want us to think about. In the Bible, there's only two places where there's mentioned a charcoal fire. Here in John chapter 21, And then the other one is in John chapter 18, which was actually the first time that Peter denied knowing Jesus while he was going through all of the trials. He denied Jesus, and it says in the text that he found himself surrounded by religious leaders at a charcoal fire. I want you to hang on to that for next week. As we continue in John, we're going to look at how Peter's ministry is really restored with Jesus after denying him 3 times. The second comparison is that Jesus feeds his disciples similarly to how he fed the 5,000. So when Jesus fed the 5,000 back in John chapter 6, he was ultimately testing the disciples. It was at the same lake, the same Sea of Galilee. It was the same food, fish and chips, fish and bread. He used the same things to communicate this. Jesus asked, where are we going to buy bread so that people can eat? This is back in John 6. Fully knowing and understanding that Jesus was going to provide this for them, that they didn't have the actual means, the money to do this themselves. So there was not enough. So what happens is that they find this little boy with 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish, and they end up dispersing all of this to the crowd of 5,000. There was so much left over that each disciple had a basket full of bread for themselves. So this idea that Jesus is teaching them, like, hey, I'm in your everything. I will provide for you far more than you could ever hope for or imagine. Just as I care for the birds of the sky, how much more am I going to care for you? When we get to John chapter 21 here, he was reminding the disciples of what he taught them back in John chapter 6. Because when the disciples come to shore, Jesus already has a fire with fish on it. He says to the disciples, hey, bring some of the fish that you've caught. And he ends up dragging over this big bag net of fish, 153 of them. And again, Jesus is always providing more than we need. And what he's doing here is preparing the disciples. I'm not going to be with you, but I'm going to continue to provide for you and lead you and be in every one of your circumstances as long as you just trust me. Follow me. Don't give up on me. Even though Jesus is about to leave them, he will continue to provide for everything that they need. And the idea is this, is that Jesus is in our everything. So without him, we can do nothing. With him, we can do anything. And so he is in our everything. So what does that mean then for us today? Because we're in this series of seeing and believing Jesus. And here we are 2,000 years later after he rose from the dead. We're not necessarily seeing him for ourselves physically, but there are things that we can see him doing, the things that he's involved with that help us to believe even today, 2,000 years later. Some points that I think we can take from this is, number one, that he is our supply. Jesus is our supply practically. The everyday needs of our lives, the bills that we have to pay, the shelter that we need, the clothes that we need to wear, he is our supply. And how much more he will supply if we do it his way, the right way, the true way, as we recognize him in every aspect of our lives. One of the many reasons why I believe in Jesus and this gospel is because I've seen him in my own life continue to provide for me, to provide for our family. When our bank account only had $15.87 and we had 2 kids, what were we going to do? I continue to see him provide for us. That's one of the reasons why I believe, because I see him in this. The other day on Friday, I was the first grass cutting of the season. I mean, the fresh aroma of grass clippings and gasoline. I love it. It was a beautiful day. Short sleeve shirt and jeans, pushing the mower back and forth. I get pretty particular with how our grass is cut, and so I love doing it. And I can remember during one section going back and forth, these nice straight lines diagonal to the house, and I just remember thinking to myself, God, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to have a yard to cut. Dean was somewhere, Shane was with Colleen out at the store, Ellie was playing on the front yard as I was doing this. Thank you. He's in our everything. He's in the yard that I'm mowing. There's lots of people that don't have yards to mow. I also understand there's people that don't like mowing lawns. I get that. I happen to like it, so I'm praising God. Thank you for allowing me to mow. Thank you for allowing me to walk behind this mower when some people can't walk. Thank you for allowing me to be out in the sun when some people can't be out in the sun. Thank you for this little girl that's playing in the front yard when so many people can't have little girls. Thank you. He's in our everything. So the question I ask you, how has Jesus provided for you practically? I mean, I think if we just take time to recognize the ordinary, everyday things, we can see him, how he's practically supplied all of our needs. Jesus is our supply in ministry. So a kind of another metaphor I like to think about when you look at this whole story with the disciples, that they're not catching any fish, and then Jesus says, hey, do it on the right-hand side of the boat. They do it. They catch all of this fish. And it goes back to this idea of when Jesus said, hey, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. If we go out and try to lead people to Jesus in our own strength, it's going to fail. We're not going to catch any fish. We're not going to catch any people. Jesus is involved in all of that, leading people to the Father and bringing them close to him. It's all him. So even in our ministry, even in Mission Community Church, it's recognizing how Jesus is involved in every aspect of it, and that he's going to provide the fish. He's going to provide the souls that are getting saved and the brokenness and how we can lead people through that. It's all Jesus. So we get away from compartmentalizing the secular from the spiritual and recognize that Jesus is in everything. And then finally, Jesus is our everything. Without him, we can do nothing. With him, we can do anything. And so the question I ask is, how is Jesus in your everything? As you examine your own life, as you examine your own routines, your own situations, how can you take time to recognize that Jesus is in everything? And it's a fine line where we're not saying Jesus is everything. That's another type of theology that's out there, but it's more of how is Jesus in everything. In him we move and breathe and have our being. So 2 simple questions I want you to ponder this week. How does Jesus provide for you practically? And how is Jesus in your everything? And I think that as we recognize that, we ourselves will be able to see and believe him even that much more. 2,000 years later after he rose from the dead.